Augustin Hadelich is one of the great violinists of our time. From Bach to Paganini, from Brahms to Bartok to Adish, he has mastered a wide-ranging and adventurous repertoire. He is often referred to by colleagues as the musician's musician. Named Musical America's 2018 Instrumentalist of the Year, he is consistently cited worldwide for his phenomenal technique, poetic sensitivity, gorgeous tone, and insightful interpretations. Welcome, Augustine.
Hi, it's great to see you again.
It is such a pleasure to see you and to speak with you again. I admire your playing so much, and you have such an amazing sound, and you have this very beautiful and natural, singing vibrato. And your sounds is one of the things that I would be interested in hearing about, actually, from you. How did you develop it, really? And do you remember thinking about this as a young student? And I'm curious, what sort of sound you think towards, for example, what influences and antecedents and things like this?
Yeah, so I think that, this was something I've always paid attention to and worked on a lot, even growing up. I think that this singing quality of the violin, or like the kind of sound that sounds like a voice that's very lyrical, that was kind of what made me fall in love with the instrument in the first place. And I always enjoyed violinists who had that kind of sound. So when I was young, I was listening to Oistrakh, I was listening to Uto Ughi, who was an Italian violinist near where I grew up. I was listening to Zuckerman. I was listening to people who had this kind of like rich, very singing way of playing. And of course, now over the years, it has changed a bit. I think it's a gradual process of looking for that sound quality and thinking about how the sound is modulated, like a voice that's not generally not like all the way steady, all the same, but it has like a shape to the phrase. So that's part of the singing as well. And so it's always been something that I think about.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned people like Oistrakh. I'm curious, are there other sort of golden age violinists, or are there like other influences besides him, who come from that golden age of playing, who you would cite as influences? I'm curious.
I think I was actually, and now that I think about it, I think I was pretty sound obsessed, because actually back when I was growing up, back when I was like 10 or 11 years old, I never wanted to hear Heifetz, because I thought that compared to Oistrakh, his sound was not as warm, not as beautiful. So I was always like, no, I want to hear it. I don't know. Eventually, as you get older, you realize there's much more to making music than sounding nice. But it is something that's I don't know. You can't help but just be affected by it when I hear a great singer sing and it has a beautiful voice. It's just you just don't want to stop listening. And I've always wanted to sound like that. I've always wanted to somehow capture that in my violin playing as well.
I know that you're playing now on an incredible instrument, the 1744 Guarneri, that belonged to Schering, Henrik Schering. And the Library of Congress, we actually have two Guarneris, actually, one owned by Fritz Kreisler. That's a real beauty, and another one that was formerly owned by Shimon Goldberg. Okay. And there's such a mystique about these great instruments, and their stories are fascinating. And I was wondering if you could tell us about this particular violin. I heard that it was sort of out of circulation for a number of years since Schering played it. And do you know where it was kept? And I know that it's considered really one of the truly great violins.
Yes, it's a very famous violin by Guarneri del Gesù, and I think it was actually the last one that he made before he died. I think Schering is probably the most famous person who had it. It's called Le Duc. It's named after a violinist who had it like in the late 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
Schering made most of his recordings on this violin. So I actually did grow up with many recordings of his, and that's I hear it a lot. I guess growing up, and I also remember even seeing a poster of it when I was a student. It was hanging in some violin shop of this violin, and I was looking at it and be like, it looks nice. So actually holding it into my hand, holding it in my hand suddenly and being like, oh my God, this is this violin, was quite an experience. And it's a stunning instrument. It's true that, it had not been played in concert after Schering's death for like about 30 years. And sometimes it can take an instrument some time to kind of wake up, so to speak. It's kind of as the instrument starts ringing a lot and gets played a lot, it's somehow, I don't know, it loosens up and it just sounds better and better. But that might be an illusion also. Sometimes I wonder if it's just that the player is just getting used to it and it's just manages then to get more out of it, because as you get to know a violin better, you are able to play it better. You start understanding how it works. So I've had it now like for a year and a half, almost 2 years, and it's been really a great time on this instrument. Every piece that I play for the first time on this instrument, I always feel like I'm somehow, in a way, like rediscovering it. Because it has a very beautiful, warm, very human sound. That's it's not just pretty; it's also somehow. It has a lot of. It's possible to do a lot with the sound in terms of shades and shades of color and changes of tone and character. The sound has a lot of complexity somehow. In it, that's sort of makes you want to. It makes you want to play and practice in a way that some violins don't. So.
Oh, okay.
So it's actually, especially during the pandemic period, I think it's. I was really happy to have an instrument like that with me, because as I'm playing in a small room and not. So the acoustics don't help. It don't sound very good, and like you're kind of in a small space. But then somehow this violin, in any space, somehow gives something special. It feels like it's. It felt like it was inspiring me during that time.
Yeah. Well, you kind of got into this subject a little bit about how the violin woke up, so like I'm curious for you, did it take a long time for it to sort of wake up? And can you sort of tell our listeners maybe what that process was like from when you first got the violin and could keep it, and what was that process like?
Well, so I should mention that the violin I had before was very good. Also, it was a
Stradivari violin, right?
Yeah, it was a Stradivari violin. It was very, very good, very also, and had many amazing qualities. So it wasn't like I immediately switched gears. I actually I had. When I received the Del Gesù, I actually still played some concerts on the Stradivarius because I just knew it so well that even though I loved the sound of the Del Gesù, I decided to still play on the Strad for a while because I knew I could play better on it because I just knew the sound of the violin so well. But then, and in the meantime, also there were things in terms of how an instrument is set up, sort of things that don't really have anything to do with the wood or the actual violin, but more like what strings you use, and is the bridge kind of too old, or are there issues with how it's set up? All sorts of things one can play around with that can make it sound much better. So I worked a little bit on that with the luthier, and then I finally made the switch. And when you switch instruments, even if it's to an instrument that you're crazy about, it does feel for a while like a little strange. It's a little bit like you suddenly speak a different language, or like if you wake up one day and your voice is different or something. It just takes a while until you are used to sounding like that. Because now when I put the bow down on the string, the sound that comes out is not what I expect. It's not what I've come to expect over the 10 years of playing the Strat. It's different.
Yeah. Well,
and so that takes a little bit of time.
Yeah. No, of course. Well, yeah, you said that you have said that the Daljesu has such a deep, rich lower register, but it has a brilliant top register and amazing strength. And so since you played on the Stradivari for such a long time, how would you characterize the differences between the two violins, since you were kind of playing them both simultaneously as you were transitioning?
Well, the Strad, like a lot of instruments of Stradivari from the later period, are like this, that it's quite a bright, brilliant sound and very focused. You can hear it, even though it's not necessarily louder than other instruments, you somehow can hear it really well, just because it's so bright. You can somehow, because of the overtones are so loud, louder than the actual note you're playing. So the ear can somehow pick out that sound even from far away in a big hall. And Daljesus sometimes work a bit differently. They just produce a high level of decibels, I think.
Okay.
So, and that's how they're heard. It's not necessarily that the sound somehow cuts through because of the overtones. Although, as I said, it has a brilliant top, this violin, which it is something that you want. I think the best Daljesus have that. Not all Daljesus have that always, but that you do want the top register of the violin to have that kind of brilliance. I think what I had to do differently, what I had to adjust, was kind of how I tackled the instrument. That as I adjusted to the Daljesu, got used to sometimes playing with more energy, because the instrument has a slightly slower response, but you can actually use much more. You can play much more energetically with your bow than on the Strat. Strats sometimes, especially, well, at least the one I had was like that it responded very, very quickly. You barely touch the string and already a sound comes out. So it's a very quick response, but it's also very sensitive, that the moment you give a tiny bit too much bow pressure onto the string, the sound starts to kind of, it sounds like it's kind of, you're choking it off, or it starts to change, to bend in pitch, or it does all sorts of things that you don't want. And so it can sound amazing, but you're always kind of on the verge of sounding horrible. Like if you just do one wrong move, then it's going to sound terrible. And it feels very dangerous to play on a Strat in that way. Like you're always taming a wild instrument on stage. Even when you already know it really well, there's always a little danger left. And Daljesu is, I think, is a very different. It's a very different feeling to play it, because when you just barely touch the string, sometimes you actually get no sound. There's a certain amount that you have to coax the violin until it actually starts ringing. It has to do with the fact that Guarneri's the wood is a little thicker, so it's somehow takes a bit more effort to get it to ring. But then the sound is really beautiful, and you can just basically the more energy you use, the louder it gets. It's in a way kind of intuitive, but of course you can't just. It's easier said than done, because to use a lot of force with the bow is actually something you have to practice a lot, because you don't.
Yeah.
You have to do it the right way. You have to use the weight of your arm efficiently, and all this. So it's something that it's not like a new concept. Of course, to some extent, I used many of those things on the Strats too, but I had to kind of develop them further with this violin. And but I think what I enjoy is that when I perform on it, and I get kind of carried away in performance and feel like I want to play even more energetically, I know that I can do it. Whereas on the Strat, there's always this voice in your head that says, "Oh, be careful, don't go too far. Don't ruin it." And I think to some I enjoy in performances just going as far as the music will take me without worrying about that. So I find it's a lot of fun to play on. I think that the last thing that was different is that while I'm playing it, I hear the violin differently than the Strat. So somehow something about the Strat sound, I always had a very clear idea of how it sounded. Like I could hear myself so clearly, which is it can be sometimes a frustrating thing too, but you're always like, it's almost like I'm looking at myself from above and like seeing everything that's happening. And
so it's like a religious experience.
I don't know. I know exactly.
No,
I could tell it was very easy to tell if stuff was in tune or not, or like if things were, I don't know, just because of how the violin rang, how clear and crisp the sound was. And on the Del Gesù, sometimes I had to kind of retrain my ears a little bit. It's possible that sometimes they sound better to the player than to the audience. So it's the opposite of the Strat. The Strat usually sounds better in the audience than under the ear, but the Del Gesù sometimes sounds great under the ear, and then it's still good but less great at the audience. So you have to I think an important thing is to kind of be objective and not get you can't get enamored in this pretty sound it's making. You have to still put in the same effort to try to make music. I think the violin can sort of, when you first start playing on it, you can get like drunk on the sound that it has, but you need to realize it doesn't. People out there don't have the ear right next to the instrument, so it won't. They won't get drunk with you. So
yeah, I'm not sure that maybe like so many like listeners like know that it's really important for a musician to sort of love their own sound, just because it can really like motivate you to sort of want to practice and find different ways of playing various repertoires. So it's a very key critical thing for like a musician about how their actual sound is, and that they enjoy the sound of their own voice if they're a singer, the sound of their violin, the sound of like whatever reeds that they're making if they're a wind instrument. So those things are all super important.
Yeah, I think you should enjoy it, but not too much. So you should enjoy it so that you're happy with your life, but but not so much that you kind of get lazy and just think like, oh, it sounds so nice. But it actually, to make great music takes a lot of effort. You have to kind of, it is important to be frustrated also, like it's a big motivator. So I don't know, true. You have to find a balance, but between the two.
Yeah, that's very true. So yeah, I just wanted to just talk just a little bit about the program.
Sure.
I would encourage all of our listeners to sort of check out the program notes that are going to be in the link below for tonight's concert. And your program ends with one of the landmark pieces of the violin repertoire, Beethoven's Ninth Sonata, also known as the Kreutzer Sonata. And I would say personally that the Kreutzer Sonata is considered the sort of pinnacle of sonata writing. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Beethoven even said himself that the sonata is written in a virtuoso style like a concerto. And yeah, you also have a very strong relationship of having performed Beethoven's violin concerto. And it's sort of very easy to see what Beethoven was talking about in the piece's radical opening chords. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts and insights about the Kreutzer Sonata? Anything you would want to share with our listeners?
Yes. Well, it's funny. I think it feels more like the Kreutzer Sonata feels more like a concerto than the Beethoven concerto in some ways, because it's so intense and so virtuosic in the writing for both instruments. I think when Beethoven said that it's I don't know what he said, in stile concertante or something like that. It's like an
exactly
sort of concerto style for both instruments. Has to do that before that. All his other sonatas, and generally in the sonata genre, never placed such a high emphasis on virtuosity, although they're certainly the other Beethoven sonatas are very difficult also, but they're not overtly virtuosic in that way. And often, sometimes, but it's particularly with other composers, with Mozart sonatas, but also some of the early Beethoven sonatas, the piano has a more primary role than the violin. You can tell this is written by a pianist, and the piano gets the melody more often than the violin does. And it's not 100% equal. Whereas in the Kreutzer Sonata, he makes an extra effort, I think, to make the two instruments equal. That sometimes it feels almost it feels like these two equal powers that are sort of vying for control sometimes, but then also playing together and singing together, but then fighting. I don't know. It's an incredible thing what he achieved, that it feels, even though the piano is playing like 5 times as many notes or something, as
normal.
as piano parts usually have, but it feels like it's these are two equal parts, and it's incredibly dramatic. There are actually some moments in earlier sonatas, for example, in the 5th sonata, that kind of, I think, where you can already hear that Beethoven is thinking about doing something like this. But here he goes all the way, that with just how passionate and dramatic that first movement is. Well, it actually starts. I mean, it starts very calm with these. But I think that's the other thing that sets the stage. That my first phrase with these double stops is extraordinarily difficult, and I play by myself, and then the piano plays. So the two players are introduced kind of separately, and only then start playing together. It's another thing he does to kind of, I think, give them equal weight, by having them sort of entering the scene after each other, and the violin entering before the piano. And I don't know. It's probably the most intense writing one can find in any of the Beethoven violin sonatas. The second movement is a theme and variations. I think Beethoven is probably the greatest composer at writing themes and variations, because themes and variations can sometimes, when a lesser composer does it,
it can be predictable a little bit.
It can be predictable and kind of dull. It's like, here's another variation. Here's another variation. You kind of like, you know what the harmonic pattern is, and like, whatever. But that's never the case in Beethoven, because he's so inventive and so clever, and there's always enough going on that it's not possible to be bored with the musical idea, because as you keep listening to it, there's always something else that happens, that changes. And there's some he gives a variation primarily to the piano, the first variation, which is very virtuosic with the violin accompanying, and then he gives a variation to the violin, which is extremely virtuosic also with the piano accompanying. And so we each get our moments, but then at the end, the last variation is very, we play together, it almost sounds like a little bit like a music box. It's a lovely feeling. And then, like I think many of his greatest variation movements, the variation form kind of disintegrates. And many of, like also in some of his piano sonatas, there's a moment when it gets more and more beautiful, and the last variation is so beautiful, and then he just basically stops being a theme and variation. He just kind of keeps dreaming, keeps staying in that mood, and you kind of want it to go on forever. And it's just one coda after another, and so you're no longer in a variation form. You just suspend it somehow, somewhere where you never want to leave. So it's this.
It's a very beautiful movement.
It's a great movement. And then the last movement is a ton of fun. It's also very, very exciting, very difficult technically. Although I'm not sure that's necessarily comes across, but it's virtuoso writing in the sense that it's quite difficult to do these patterns. This kind of writing rhythm. So it sounds like you're riding on a horse. On the violin, it's hard. To put it in the most basic terms, it's hard because we have two directions to move the bow, down and up, and one of the notes is shorter than the other. So when you go da 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 da, you eventually run out of bow.
Yeah.
Because one note is longer than the other one. So you always have to somehow find a way to play the short note with more bow and the long note with less bow. So that da 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 da. Or many violinists play it. I don't know about the camera. So many violinists play it the other direction, but whichever way you do it, it's pretty hard. And then on the piano, it's hard because you have to repeat the same note.
Very quickly. And
the key doesn't always come up as fast as you want. And so pianists will often use two different fingers. So they'll play the same note, but with two different fingers rapidly. And so it's, in rehearsals, it's common that there are a lot of curse words that are uttered, but it's a lot of fun. It's exhilarating to play. I love this movement too.
Well, no, that's true. Yes, and it's yes, and like the final movement of the Kreutzer, like I think shares an interesting link with the Sixth Sonata from the I think that's Opus 30 #1 or something like this. Like the final movement of the Kreutzer was I think originally written to complete the Sixth Sonata, but then I guess Beethoven must have realized that stylistically the movement did not quite fit, so he held on to the movement and wrote this replacement movement to the Sixth Sonata, and eventually, I guess he thought, oh well, this movement will work for the Kreutzer, so it was kind of something in his drawer.
Beethoven was always doing stuff like that he put stuff in the drawer and had ideas. I think by the time he was done with the movement, he always had ideas left over, and he didn't throw them out. He used them. He reused them later. And in this case, if this was the last movement of the Sixth Sonata, it would be quite imbalanced. It would be suddenly a shock to have this movement at the end of that. And I think he recognized that there's a similarity between the theme of in this new last movement and one of the themes in the first movement. Somewhat the outline of the theme is similar, and so I think with the and in the first movement. So I think that might have also swayed him, and maybe just the virtuosity and intensity of it that he realized this fits perfectly. He was very good at editing his own music. I think this is a very hard. This is a very hard thing when you write something. I think because by the time it has gone, you've thought about it, and it's gone through your head, and you've written it down. It's natural to be very attached to your own idea. It's the hardest thing to edit and realize actually objectively, like, oh, this idea is not as good as that. And somehow Beethoven was so brilliant at this. All his decisions, every decision he took made the piece better somehow. He had good judgment.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, just because that's kind of one of the resources that we sort of have at the Library of Congress, is sort of having sketches and manuscripts of composers, just because then one can really sort of see, well, why did they change this? And then you really do realize that, for a composer like Beethoven, he would sort of constantly reanalyze and rethink how a phrase should be shaped or how a phrase should be harmonized when, one has so many options. So, I wanted to just kind of stick with this idea of technique for a moment. One of the short Spanish pieces actually on your program is a transcription from a guitar work. And I feel like I read somewhere that you said it's difficult because of the ricochets. And can you kind of elaborate for our listeners a little bit about this technique of ricochet?
Yes, this is a piece called Recuerdos de la Alhambra, so Memories of the Alhambra, which is this beautiful castle
in southern Spain.
In southern Spain. It's a gorgeous place. And this is a guitar piece by Francisco Tárrega, which guitar aficionados, know this this piece because it's very beautiful and atmospheric. And on the guitar, they do this thing called tremolo, where they play with different fingers. They play the same string quite quickly, so they can get like this repeated note. And on the violin, in the violin transcription by Ruggero Ricci, we do this by bouncing the bow several times. So always 3 times downwards, and then you go once upwards. And it's a difficult technique because the bow has to bounce on its own. You just give a first impulse, and then it rebounds, like dropping a ball on the table, and it kind of bounces back. And but this has to be controlled because it has to bounce at the right speed and the right number of notes. So you don't suddenly have a hole in there, or in the line that it's continuous, that it's not too many notes. So it has to be controlled just the right way. And the other thing that's hard is that because you have 3 notes going down and 1 note going up, that just like the place I talked about in Beethoven, that you could run out of bow basically, because you go 1, 2, 3, and then 1 up, and the 1 up you actually have to recover all that distance. It's hard, but the trick is, well, I mean, there's no shortcut. Like you have to practice it a lot, but that's the trick. But basically, it's about understanding gravity and using the gravity efficiently. The bow should actually do everything by itself, and you're just giving it 1 impulse to start the down bow and 1 impulse to start the up bow. So you just occasionally give an impulse, but actually most of the notes should be played by the bow just bouncing. And that's a very hard thing to kind of give up control like that, but I think it's the only way to do it reliably, because the gravity and the weight of the bow, they don't change. They will always be the same. So the more you let those things play the notes, the more sure you can be that it'll work. Whereas what your hand does might be different. I mean, you can't control 100% every single muscle of your body every time. So this is I spent a lot of time on this figuration, and it's quite frustrating because sometimes there are string changes, and that changes entirely how the bow bounces. Sometimes there are no string changes, and so actually. There, even though all those patterns look the same and sound the same, there are I would say 6 or 7 different versions that keep alternating, where you have to actually do very different motions. But I love the atmosphere of the piece. It's very very beautiful and peaceful, and so I love playing it. As an encore, actually, I started playing it quite a lot as an encore 2 years ago. And in the context of this program, it sort of takes at the end of the Debussy sonata, we kind of take this road to Spain, kind of, because there are a lot of Spanish influences in the Debussy, sort of different flourishes and that are very Spanish. And then of course Orion's piece. Spanish and the Romanza Andaluza by Sarasate. So we kind of go in that direction. But then we leave Spain and go back to Vienna for Kreutzer.
I thank you for that wonderful explanation of ricochets and everything. And it was kind of like a mini masterclass, not only for me, but for our listeners. And yeah, like I just wanted to just like to take a moment just to like congratulate you on your appointment to Yale. That's great. Yeah, you like have this teaching position so that you can sort of pass on this wonderful knowledge. You explained that so beautifully and so succinctly. So thank you for that. So I know that during the pandemic that you were very much engaged in making recordings of all kinds on your own, and you recorded one of the Paganini caprices that our viewers will see in your home studio. And I'm curious, how did you get interested in recording?
Normally, I think before the pandemic, most of my life was spent. I was kind of living for the stage, right? I loved performing. That was most of what I did and what I wanted to do. And occasionally, I went into I did recordings, sometimes actually live recordings, but other times I went into the studio. But it wasn't quite the focus. But when everything was canceled, I realized I had to keep busy and set some goals for myself and somehow have something to work towards. And because otherwise all I'm looking at is my calendar with, one canceled concert after another. I don't know, it was kind of like it was a little demoralizing at first. So I started doing some small recordings at home. I mean, a lot of musicians like just, you take out the camera and just play some things just so you can give something for your listeners and fans to hear while they're also stuck at home, because we're all in the same boat. But as I was posting things, and people, of course, some of my fans kept requesting like the most outrageous and most difficult things. And so I was revisiting different showpieces and crazier things, and so finally one of the requests was to play the 5th Paganini Caprice with the original bowing. But actually, we just talked about Ricochet, so I have to repeat. This piece, yes, also uses a kind of Ricochet bowing. Ricochet literally means rebound, right? And so it's the French term for this bow stroke because as I said, the bow just kind of bounces on its own after a first impulse. And here also it's 3 notes, ba, 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 and then 1 up. Ba, 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 ba. And I would say usually this caprice is actually performed with the notes separate because you can play faster. And to an audience of non-string players who don't necessarily know what Ricochet is, the separate version might sound better, and because it's faster and clearer, and so they just think they assume it's harder actually, and that it sounds good. And so I've often in the past just performed it separate because I just figured, why should I go through all this trouble if it sounds even faster when I do it separate? But I've come to appreciate this original bowing. I have my doubts whether Paganini did it the entire way through because he often, I think, when he sent stuff to publication, I suspect he made things a little more difficult just to further the legend of Paganini. He was always, I think, working on that and spreading tall tales about his abilities.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's something that occasionally there have been some crazy violinists who attempt it and to just make a point of, no, I'm going to play the original bowing, and so it's among violinists it's kind of this, and it's I don't know, it's a notorious thing that's really, really difficult. And so I decided I have the time now. I'm just gonna figure this out. And so I practiced it a lot, and then finally recorded it with this bowing. So yeah, the bowing is very, very, very hard. I think what's even harder than doing the original bowing, what took me more time than that, is then to try to still play with some musical nuance and direction and phrasing, and that makes it much more difficult than just making the bow stroke. But I don't know. It was fun. It was fun to work on and motivating. And then all these videos, actually, I find it really boosted my morale to get then responses from people who were watching it. And I don't know. That was very motivating because I was missing I guess, I don't know, I was really spoiled by I was used to every week or two just walking on a stage somewhere and playing for people.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah. Well, one thing that I was like sort of so moved by was just like your creativity in doing it. So like you had the one Caprice recording that I think it was directed by Lara St. John, and then you also you made a very sort of fantastic video that was an animation feature. It was
Right. Yeah.
I think it's called the Fantasia dei Gatti, and I
Genau.
mean, yeah,
Yes.
it's so charming. Yes, like how how you brought together Paganini and cats, and I just wanted
Yeah.
to sort of ask you, how did your collaboration with the animator Tam King come about? How did that come about? Yeah, because it's such a wonderful thing that you created together.
Yeah, it took a long time from the first idea until it was done, and I didn't have a clear. It's not like I saw what it would be like in front of me. It was just a vague association between that particular caprice and cats, because the motive of that caprice kind of sounds a little bit like meowing, and I think it's very possible that it actually was Paganini's intention, because he did often imitate animals in his concerts, and like, I mean, there's nothing he wouldn't do to elicit the response from the audience. I think when he had a difficult audience, he would, I think, he would probably make cat noises. So it's kind of like, it kind of sounds a little bit like meowing, and so I suddenly had this idea: what if I am playing for these cats? I played this caprice for them because in a way I'm speaking their language to them, and we start to understand each other, and they start to dance, and something happens. That's as far as it went, and I actually even explored it for a while, just doing it with real cats, but I quickly realized that's not going to work. And then I met a director who had worked on a lot of short movies and some stuff with music. Called Paul Glickman, and he was the one who introduced me to Tam King.
Oh, okay.
Because he had worked on another video based on Copeland's El Salón Mexico. They did a cartoon together for that piece, and he introduced me to her, and then she started to get involved, and then her drawings kind of took it to totally to another level, because she came up with really the personalities of the different cats, and started drawing the backgrounds, and so suddenly we realized. I don't know if it might have been her idea that it was an alleyway. I don't remember, but anyway, she somehow imbued the whole thing with another atmosphere, and whereas I think Paul Glickman, he had a lot of suggestions relating to the little gags and jokes that happen along the way. I mean, there's certain amounts of cartoon comedy that also happens along the way, and I think that also helps. Because it's tricky when in a cartoon you kind of have to stay engaged sort of the whole time as a viewer, whereas when you're just listening to the music, it doesn't seem like a big deal that nothing happens for 5 seconds, but somehow when you watch a cartoon, that's a long time. That's like a lot of frames, and so together they storyboarded the whole thing, and so from the time actually this team started working on it, it took 4 years until it was done. Actually, it was because it wasn't a big studio and a team, and it wasn't like a company is going to work on it for 2 months. It was these people kind of took it on, and then Tam got some of her friends. At the time, she was still in school, like in film school. So she got some of her friends to help out. One of them helped with the sound. One of them helped with the coloring, and the other one with the these. I mean, what it actually is, it's not like every frame. It's like digital puppets, like in a animation software, but those have to be programmed first. And so it was, and then of course a lot of fussing around afterwards, after the animation was done, with little details, and it was a big project, but it was a lot of fun. And
it sounds like it was a very it sounds like it was a very large collaboration, but it shows just because it's so entertaining.
I love it, but for many times there were moments when I thought this is never going to happen. This will never finish, because, but then somehow it did, and it wasn't, and I don't know, it was, it's great in ways that I hadn't imagined at the start. So I loved the process of it. I mean, in a way, all I did was I provided the music, and then kind of like feedback and criticism, and like I mean, as a musician, I'm really, really picky about what it looks like when,
of course,
a cartoon figure holds a violin. And so
it has to look authentic, and it was really very, very well done.
Yeah.
But just sort of like, yes, and like it's just sort of just in closing, but like keeping in this theme of video and recording, I just had to say personally that during the pandemic, I felt like I discovered many things through your video recordings that I came across. And it's, firstly, I discovered you're not only a great violinist, but then you're actually also a pretty good pianist, and that you would, and I saw, and I was sort of shocked to see that you accompanied yourself in a couple of videos. But however, what I wanted to say is that another important discovery that I made through your recordings were your works and your recordings by Clarence Cameron White and Eddie South. And I would encourage all of our listeners to sort of check out your recordings that you made by these two musicians and composers. I believe there's this video of you, Augustine, where you're accompanying yourself and also playing on the violin, Black Gypsy by Eddie South, and it's truly stunning playing. And I'm just curious, how did you come to discover these composers and musicians, and are there others that you have discovered and learned about? Just because I actually didn't know Eddie South, and so that was completely new for me. And I thank you for like being my portal into this great violinist that even myself I had no idea existed.
Yeah, Eddie South was pretty special. Yeah. Well, I think he's actually, it's funny because he's obscure even in the jazz world. He's kind of obscure, but then in the classical violin world, he's even more obscure, because for a lot of classical people, he's a jazzer. But in the jazz world, maybe he was too classically trained to like be. I don't know. He never quite sort of fit the I don't know, they never quite had the profile that like that he would somehow fit neatly into what people thought a jazz musician should be. So I found I heard something of, I don't remember now actually when, but I knew about the name, like but I didn't know him too well. But there was a moment last summer when I was kind of like exploring. I decided to kind of look into more music by Black composers and kind of see. And I was quite surprised just like how much there was that wasn't obscure. Like it wasn't like I had to dig it out of some attic somewhere. Like it was out there, but somehow nobody was playing it, and I think because violinists, we always just play what everyone else plays. I think we're so.
That's true.
There's a trend to be very boring with your choices. You just kind of do what everyone else does. So I think, and I suddenly realized, well, I think if I start playing some of these things, a lot of other people will start as well. I don't think it's. And I mean, I'm not the only one who had this idea last summer, because there was a general moment of like a reckoning, just like thinking, well, maybe we should champion more music by people of color. But basically, I think Eddie South is maybe the most obscure thing that I, in the sense that it's almost impossible to find the music. But the way I managed to get my hands on this piece is that I found someone who had a copy of sheet music that had been published back in the 30s, but it's been out of print for like 80 years or something. And his name is Jeremy Cohen, and he's from the Quartet San Francisco. And they had this is a quartet that has recorded an album of like covers of Eddie South stuff. And so he had some materials, and I got this music, and then they made this home recording. I think some of the other stuff that I learned is much more readily accessible. So Clarence Cameron White, Levy Dance, that's a piece that actually Heifetz recorded and played quite a bit. And it was kind of like it was a pretty well-known encore piece. But I think that genre of encore repertoire, in quotation marks, has sort of fallen by the wayside anyway, right? Like there's a lot of, it used to be that there were like sort of 400 like standard violin encores, and now, I don't know, people still play like 20 of them, I think. So, and this is one of them, but it's a really fun piece that I've enjoyed playing as well. And let's see, then there was, I think the composer that I'm just enjoying so much is Coleridge Taylor Perkinson.
Yeah,
it's an American composer, not to be confused with Samuel Coleridge Taylor or Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I don't know, it's like confusing, but
yeah, no, it is confusing. But yeah, like he was much more contemporary. Died not too long ago in New York City.
Yeah, like 15 years ago or something, he died.
Exactly, yeah.
And he wrote several pieces for solo violin that are amazing. That also fit the instrument incredibly, and that is really kind of they are sort of blues inspired, but you know the way, I mean, but are classical compositions, I would say, in the way that they're constructed. Remind me a little bit of Isai, actually, in the way that they somehow seem to kind of almost originate from the violin and where the notes are on it. And I love his music too. I'm thinking, there was also a piece by Daniel Bernard Roumain that I learned last summer.
Okay. DBR.
So DBR. That was very different. It was called Filter, and that's kind of comes out of improvisation, because he sort of improvises himself on the violin, and it has a different. It's a little more kind of more Jimi Hendrix style violin playing in a way, sort of. But it was fun to explore that too.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, well, no, I'm so glad that, it was really a pleasure for me to sort of like discover some of those composers, because I really did not know Eddie South at all. And so that was a really fun discovery. Augustine, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. It's great to see you again. We can only unfortunately do an hour, but I can't wait to be able to sort of experience your playing live and in person again. And thank you for taking the time to share. You did this wonderful concert video with the Library of Congress. We're most grateful, and we look forward to being able to bring you in person in the library in the future.
Great. It's great to talk to you. Thanks so much.